Welcome back to the 280th episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including how the bipartisan consensus just keeps on pushing us into debt, then how they use economic growth policy in order to make up for that and how it's not actually working out, and we'll end today with a story about the economics of the WNBA, Caitlynn Clarks. Since we're on economics, we want to have a little bit of fun, throw in a little whimsical story in there. And, of course, we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, if you were to cut any program out there, which program would you cut? And yes, I know there are probably a lot of you who will immediately jump to Social Security, Medicare, or some people may just inherently say, oh, you know what, we're going to get rid of XYZ underneath the military umbrella. We're going to make sure that that spending's gone. But I want to focus a little bit broader. Would you keep funding the SEC at its current rate? Would you want to cut funding from the IRS? Would you want to stop certain tax credits that go to companies or, low tax zones that possibly happen across the United States and all the different ports, and we actually start losing revenue from it? All these sort of things. What kind of programs like that would you like to cut? Just an interesting thought, because we always have to take a larger perspective when we're talking about debt, because the idea is, we're going to keep on trudging forward. We're just going to, cut taxes, or in some cases, raise taxes, and we're going to cut spending, or sometimes we're going to keep spending how it is. Other people say we're going to raise spending, but all these things come in different variations. They come in tandem, and then they say, we're going to keep on going as we're going, basically, because even if they make promises about raising taxes in order to pay for things, guess what? New programs get issued because they have an agenda that they want to put out there. And do the taxes they raise completely offset what they're proposing? Great. What about the debt from beforehand? This is the bipartisan consensus that we can't actually address the debt, or at least it's not politically advantageous to us, because guess what? You would probably have to lower military spending for a while. You would have to cut Social Security and Medicare, or at least alter the structure of the programs for sure. And then you would also have to keep slicing into programs and fat in other places. There may be less money that goes to helping facilitate interstate commerce, which business executives would not like. There would probably be less stimulus and tax credits for different areas across the economy, especially in the environmental area. We have lots of different tax credits for carbon, which are meant to offset and trying to force a certain type of behavior out of people. So we actually are getting money for sort of behavior modification that we're trying to go for. Great. But all these different programs all have to be looked at, and we're going to have to cut a good chunk of them, because at the end of the day, and I think military spending, like I said, is on the table, but a lot of people are going to say, okay, that's the one thing we do need to keep, or we need to keep public services. So National Guard funding that goes out to each state, I do believe that most of it is acquired and actually funded through each individual state. That's the whole point. But there are funds that the U.S. government sends in for defense and proper maintenance of states that, money's fungible, so it does end up going to National Guard. So maybe National Guards, as a result of cutting back on some of this funding that would come from the U.S. government, would actually start to shrink. And people might not like that either. They may not like the idea of having a protective force within their own state. Some people would be totally fine. I mean, if you're living in a low-crime state like Maine, you probably don't care as much. Then again, if Canada invades, you may regret that. You may want it. But I don't see Canada invading anytime soon. But the point being that we are just trudging forward. And our first article comes from the Wall Street Journal, and it talks about exactly this. Headline reads, Essay, Will Debt Sink the American Empire? And this is one of the questions that both sides like to pretend that they talk about. I've just outlined how there are so many different proposals how to get there, but then when it comes down to what we're actually going to do, it never actually happens. So let's jump to a quote from about the middle of the article, because it's trying to highlight the current situation between President Joe Biden and former President Trump and the election going forward. Quote, in the presidential race, there's not much partisan difference or advantage on this subject. Actually, to give a little bit more context, we'll jump back a paragraph. America is cruising into uncharted seas of federal debt, with a public seemingly untroubled by the stark numbers and a government seemingly incapable of turning them around. And then we say, in the presidential race, there's not much partisan difference or advantage on this. Donald Trump and President Biden have overseen similar additions to the nation's accumulating debt in a range of $7 trillion in each case, according during their terms. The national response in both has been, by and large, look the other way. So whether that be spending from Trump in all the various aspects, or maybe even cutting taxes, which means that the deficit increases, because if you're putting in new proposals, or you're not finding a way to cut old proposals, old laws, or even old regulations that cost money, then when you make a tax cut, you're going to have to say, okay, so we just actually cut all these things. Maybe we were really close to a surplus, but now we're not bringing in as much money. So, and also you remember, we've talked about this before, even with Trump's rule of for every one regulation we put in, which was a more of a fast rule, it wasn't actually always 100% applied this way, but for his rule, which is for every one regulation we put in, you actually get rid of two. That obviously doesn't mean that we're going to get rid of the most expensive ones. People wanted to say, and let's be clear, he is trying to cut down on rules and regulations. That is something that conservatives and business owners like in general. And some people tried to make an economic argument about it, saying, hey, we're trying to cut costs this way. But just because you're cutting two and putting in one doesn't necessarily mean that the value, the amount to spend between those is necessarily equal, especially considering the ones that you could easily call off the books when you're trying to initially get, old regulations out of there. They're probably not the most expensive ones because they were, lackluster, or they're not enforced very well, or they never got the proper funding, so on and so forth. But the point being is that both, and people on the left point this out all the time, Trump said that he was going to, rein in the swamp, and he basically let the swamp keep going as a deficit machine. Now, let's be clear. Have any of those people making those criticisms ever come out and had a way to actually get somewhere on this? Some have said, we're just going to increase taxes on people that are over making money over the $400,000 limit, or their point, it's actually a floor, because from that point up, you're actually getting taxed a lot. But would that actually solve all the problems? No, it would help, bite into it a little bit. But then we would actually, in my opinion, we've talked about this before, how in the 80s, in the 70s, before the tax rate was actually brought down by Ronald Reagan, and it was so high for individuals, a lot of them were just keeping their assets. And we're talking about the millionaires and a few, I don't know if there were technically that many billionaires at that point, but the point being that a lot of them, they actually kept a lot of the money in their business. And when I say keep in their business, I don't mean, oh yeah, we're just going to keep reinvesting, which is the idea of keeping the money in your business. No, hey, I'll lower my compensation this year by $200,000 if it's going to allow the company to keep growing, to give a few more benefits to the people who work underneath me, possibly pay out some dividends. That would be a righteous way to actually keep money in a company. But no, they maybe make a shell company, or they have a few different bank accounts where it's, oh, this is executive pay, and they kind of shield it away from taxes so that they don't have to pay it personally, and then they can leech off of it, pull out of it slowly and surely. And I use the word leech, and that kind of has a negative connotation. They were being smart. They were using the tax system in order to protect their money that they had earned, or at least they felt as though they were rightly entitled to, because some people do deserve a $250,000 salary. Some other people make millions upon millions, especially when you can do it in stock options rather than having to give them cash, because guess what? You are making them more invested in the company as an executive if you're giving them stock options. And also, you are just coming out, you're using a pool of stock options that you've bought back from the market normally in most cases, because that's why a lot of companies do stock buybacks. Some people, the criticism comes out that it's all about juicing the numbers on the stock side. That's fair enough. I understand that some people think that way, but also you have to look at where they go, where those stocks go, because they don't just pass out of existence. They are owned by the company. They can sell them off in the future if they need to raise more funds, and also some of them go into a special fund for executives and people who want to actually get stock as an option in their compensation package. So what I'm getting at in all of these examples is that we know that we've tried different tax policies before, and I'll be honest, raising money is great. If you have a GoFundMe and you're saying, hey, I am in crippling debt, I need you to help me out, and we're going to raise $100,000 is going to help me pay off all my previous loans, that's great. But if you're taking out new loans at the time and you pay off those previous loans and you end up having about the same, maybe a little bit more, you have to address the spending. You have to address where all that money is going out the door. So tax cuts, tax rises, I understand why they are battled over, because at the end of the day, the narrative from one side is, hey, we want to tax the wealthy. We want to make sure that they are paying their fair share, even corporations. And the other side is, we want to make sure that the economic profits of the companies and the people go directly to them and is not just ham-fisted taken away from them into the federal government. And great, we can have those battles over that, because at the end of the day, that is something that people care about electorally. But if we do not address the spending, it's not going to matter. If the spending keeps going up and you do a tax cut, guess what? The deficit gets larger. If the spending keeps going up and you do a wealth tax or you do various forms of tax, eventually there will be a point where you are just funding too many things that you can't actually tax for. And I'm not saying, I know that's a slippery slope fallacy to pretend as though that's always going to happen. But if you take it to its logical extreme where we just keep raising the tax rate in order to keep paying off these debts, unless you stop spending, unless you say, hey, we're going to cut off all new spending right here, then it will happen, because we're going to add more programs. The government continues to grow. It's just the natural progression, as we've seen, no matter how much we've tried. The only time we've had a surplus in the last 25, 26 years was under Bill Clinton. And the article actually nicely pulls this out. It says, hey, yeah, underneath the Bill Clinton years, we actually had a little bit of a surplus. Quote, Washington has been adding to the national debt at an alarming pace, but not so long ago, beginning in the 1990s, the federal government budget was actually in a surplus for at least a time. This year, it will come to $1.9 trillion in the red, the Congressional Budget Office forecasts just this week. So, yeah, there was that moment. There was that moment that we had a surplus, and I'll be honest, I do always enjoy hearing about surpluses, because we want to make sure that it's not out of the lexicon. When things like Virginia as a state had a surplus, then our governor put it out there as extra money, the Youngkin Bucks, and it's ironic because they started cutting programs. I was with a friend's family member, and they brought up the fact that they're cutting benefits to certain families, and these are military families, so there are people that served our nation. You could make an even stronger argument if you're in favor of providing benefits to people, especially for this small group of people. And I said, oh, wow, okay, we ran a surplus, and then we got Youngkin Bucks. Maybe that Youngkin Bucks could have been used somewhere else. These are all contentions, and the actual moral of the story is just, it's interesting how money gets thrown around, and sometimes it is just used as a political tool to say, hey, Youngkin Bucks, hey, I as the governor gave you money, and that is a political tool that he's using at his disposal. But the reason that I like that Virginia was in a surplus, and not just the fact that Youngkin is a politician using his levers of power in order to boost his image, is the fact that there was a surplus. When anybody hears that there was a surplus, it reminds them that it is possible, because during my lifetime, I have heard nothing but deficit, 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 deficit. Okay, this word is, it's the debt crisis. Deficit spending, deficit. It is pervasive. Okay, so when you hear about surpluses and that comes back into the lexicon. Like I said, when it is used, when people understand that it is possible, they can also understand that maybe it's something we can strive towards. They don't just get caught in the cycle of, oh yeah, the deficit's this big, the deficit's this big. Oh no, what would the opposite be? The opposite would be that we actually rein in our spending. Now I know, pie in the sky, I'm thinking, I am absolutely crazy. You're sitting there, Alex, you are out of your mind. What? What? The government actually reining in its spending, caring about its citizens, making sure that it's not betting on the futures of themselves and their children, and giving assets and debt that could be leveraged to foreign nations, especially when the main one is our geopolitical adversary, China. And then you wonder why we're so afraid to actually stand up to them sometimes, because, on a whim, they could, in theory, call in their debt. Now, we own a lot of their debt. We have a lot of investment there. Our economies are definitely intertwined to some degree, even though there's been an attempted decoupling from both of them, especially on China's side, as they try to bolster a lot more of their domestic industries. But the point being that all of these things, all of those things I just pointed out, they are not in the front minds of the politicians. What they're thinking is, how can I help my people? Okay, so if we're going to be good-natured, how can I help my people? Oh, okay, a certain food tax credit would really help underprivileged people in my area. And you know what? We'll have a extra food tax on every single bill in my county. We'll have an extra 5 cents. It's a blanket 5 cents. If you spend $10, it's 5 cents. If you spend $5, it's 5 cents. And we'll use that money in order to put the program together. Great. If it doesn't actually end up funding the entire program, because normally the budgeting for the program never is accurate. No offense, but most budgets normally go over them. Especially, I did an internship in the construction industry there for a while, and they said, yeah, it's almost always over budget and over time. And if it isn't, and if it's under that, then you have done a really good job managing a project. I was like, okay, let's aim for that. But the point being that even if you say this extra tax that I'm putting in right now will definitely pay for it, and then it goes over budget, then you're starting to run a deficit. So that's the best case scenario. That's someone who actually genuinely cares about their community, and they're trying to put something together, and then it falls into a situation where they are, taking out loans, or trying to issue bonds for the community in order to actually fund these things, and then they have debt on the books. And then there's the other cynical play, which is, what can I give my constituents that will make them happy? What can I argue that they deserve? Medicare for all is a big one. A lot of people make that argument nowadays. You deserve, as a United States citizen, as a person on this planet, you deserve free healthcare. And let's be clear, it's not anywhere close to actually coming to fruition, but the conversation always happens, and it is a famous example of one where politicians say, hey, this is something where we believe you have the right to it, or at least they know, whether or not they actually believe it, they know that it is a political winner, and they're willing to just kick the can down the road. They're willing to say, hey, we will start worrying about this now. We will fund this right now. Don't you worry your cute little heads about it. And at the end of the day, we will just borrow. We'll just issue some bonds. We're going to increase the debt, which means we're going to have to increase the debt payments, the interest payments on said debt. And we're just going to bet that U.S. companies and the American people are going to become more productive. That's a huge part of this conversation that always gets left out. Productivity hasn't increased that much since the 90s, which means that even though some people may be working more hours, or they could be working the same hours, and there's a little bit of extra money flowing around the economy because of different types of goods, specialization, things like that, without increases in productivity, you can't just keep betting on the future, because eventually things will stagnate, and actually economic growth will slow down. But the government also has a solution for that, and that is the focus of our second article, which is an opinion piece that comes from the Wall Street Journal, from WAPO. And the headline reads, Opinion: How a long, debt-loving bipartisan consensus has warped U.S. business. So you can see where the through line is here. You can see why I have these two different articles back to back. We start with what is happening with the debt, why the debt is continuing to go as it does, and also trying to address the cultural issues around it, which is why we don't want to actually deal with it. We just kind of lollygag along. But then also, we use this next example because guess what? I think that actually talking about the psychology of the populace is very important here. So people want to live in a country that feels successful. It's called the winning mentality, or I take that back. That's not necessarily called the winning mentality in U.S. populations or sociology. The winning mentality is you want to be on the winning team. You want to be in a country that feels like it's doing great. That's why a lot of people come to America. They feel like there's economic opportunity here. Our GDP for 20 some years has almost consistently been growing, pretty consistently around 2%, even though China outpaced that rapidly. The point being that, hey, we're on an upward trend here. But is that natural growth? Is that investment? Is that added productivity from different tools and the way that people approach work? Or is that a government program? It's a government program. And the government knows that people want to feel as though they're in a winning economy. They want their investments to keep going up on the Dow Jones. They want to make sure that every single citizen feels as though America is a place for them. And also, they want this mentality to permeate into the world because we also are an advanced economy with lots of natural born citizens who don't necessarily want to do harder work. And we invite people from around the world to come and say, hey, okay, we will give you a leg up. You start at the bottom and now you get here. Sorry, I had to do the music line there. But let's be clear. I'm not saying it's like a concerted effort where they say, oh, well, but we have to increase immigration, so on and so forth. There are lots of proponents and lots of think tanks that talk about the fact that the U.S. economy would not survive, or at least would have a very hard time getting by without people coming in across the border. I'm not trying to make that overly political. It is a talking point on one side when people say, hey, we just need to shut down immigration. The other side comes back with, okay, well, what happens to this sector? What happens to our fruit sector? What happens to construction? So on and so forth. These are things that you actually have to think of. And also, we have to keep those options open so more people can come into the economy and they can actually possibly increase productivity. They can provide the services that we really want them to. And guess what? The government is involved in that very intimately, and that is a policy proposal that has knock-on economic effects. Well, there are just straight economic proposals or even policies that they would appear that they're not necessarily, they kind of are economic, but not necessarily. And that is the U.S. government's propping up of U.S. business and kind of removing the consequences from, or removing the risk from, or the better term here is socializing the risk for some of these companies. The paragraph I want to start you with is, quote, but Schwarma argues the business cycle is dampened by piling up debt. In the bailout culture, slowing growth stimulates financial markets, which anticipate fresh gushers of government money. So, guess what? The government gives money once, and then Wall Street and all these other companies are like, oh, hey, they're giving out money. Oh, well, hey, let's wait until we have the next surplus coming in here. Maybe we wait until the Fed actually lowers interest rates so we can get more easy money. And that's why you see the stock market violently sway depending on where they think the prediction for the interest rate that the Fed's going to put out is going to go. So we've talked about this before as well on the podcast, how the stock market may not be 100% just this is the best company. Lots of speculation in there, which is fair enough. But even then, it's AI algorithms, and a lot of it is because of how involved the U.S. government is inside the economy. If they give out tax breaks or they give out tax credits to EV companies, guess what? That stock is going to shoot up because now that company has more disposable income. They don't have to spend that extra $100,000 to be in compliance with that one thing, or they don't have to spend the extra $1 million to outfit all of their plants in order to produce this. No, they're just getting given U.S. money, government money, and guess what? Money is fungible. So if you get an extra $1 million from here, that's another $1 million that's freed up from your own coffers that you don't necessarily have to pay back to anyone. You don't have to take out a loan or anything like that. And it is, I don't want to say that it's unnatural, but it slants the market one way or the other, not just on Wall Street, but actually in the business atmosphere. So let's keep on going here. Quote, between 1790s and 1970s, Schwammer writes, the nation ran consistent surpluses with significant deficits only during 5 crises: War of 1812, Civil War, Great Depression, and the 2 World Wars. Since 1970, there have been significant deficits every year but 4. Conservatives' faith that tax credits will pay for themselves is mirrored in progressives' faith that their investments will pay for themselves. The result is the same debt. And I think he's talking very, very importantly about both sides here. Like I said, if you just have tax cuts without cutting spending, you are still going to run a deficit. And if you are just investing, paying into a system in the future, just investing, hey, we're investing in the American people. We are going to invest in this infrastructure. Great. Yes, sure. But if you just keep increasing spending and you keep investing, one, you can't actually test to see if the old investment or the new investment is the one spurring on the current growth. But also, you're probably not going to see, because guess what? Some investments fail. So you're probably going to see, if anything, this is a best case. It all levels out, and all your spending is basically equal, and then you have to include the interest on the debt that you've been paying. Worst case scenario, it doesn't pay for itself, and then we are still increasing taxes in order to pay for it, and guess what? Same thing. We're running a deficit. So, yeah, I think he makes a really good point calling out the bipartisan side of this. I also think that there's another part that I really wanted to talk about specifically because it's about socializing the risk. Quote, and this is taking the risk from these companies, the financial risk when they get bailed out, and then the government pays them. It pays the bailout, or at least it tries to restructure things in a bankruptcy filing. Think Republic, One Republic Bank, or what's the other one that was in California? Oh, goodness, wow. I feel really terrible that I can't remember the name of it. Silicon Valley Bank, there we go. But the point being that the government actually takes on this debt burden or any of these failings on their part, especially with banks, because they have to, for the most part, especially with the FDIC, they have to pay out to the customers who lost their money. But very often with these big bailouts, they do it not just to the people that have FDIC insurance, but also to the big executives, and they end up getting a pay package out of it. But this bailout culture socializes the risk. It puts the burden of the company's failings on the society. Quote, because of the fiscal follies during the pandemic, forgiven loans, hitherto called grants, cash downpours, recipients, including most Americans and many of them gainfully employed, fattened bank deposits by $3.5 trillion. The government issued more debt in 12 months than it had in the first 2 centuries. 2 centuries after. Hold on. Take that back. No, seriously, take that in. In 12 months, we issued $3.5 trillion in debt. And within the first 2 centuries, not decades, centuries, the first 200 years of our existence as a country, we issued more debt in 12 months than those 200 years. Not only does this talk about the weird way that we do inflation, where we keep, putting more money into the economy, trying to artificially have good numbers when it comes to growth, and therefore it makes things very distorted because we have to start adjusting math for inflation. But also, it's a drug. Okay, hey, spending. Yeah, we can just keep spending on whatever we want, and it just ends terribly every single time. So, sorry, I wanted to talk about the bailout culture, but I thought that was interesting context, and then I really got struck by the number there. But let's jump to the bailout culture. Quote, hitherto, the cleansing effect of large recessions called weak companies, causing a 20% increase in bankruptcies. But because of the bailout culture during the pandemic, corporate bankruptcies declined. Did you even notice Biden's $36 billion bailout of the Teamsters retirement plan in 2022? Yes, I did actually notice that, and that made me very frustrated. But the point being here is, no longer do some of these big banks, some of these big investment firms have to make the most prudent decisions because, we're too big to fail. And I know this is a common criticism. It's not 100% accurate with a lot of people. They're still trying to be prudent and they still have a hard time. But even if they are not doing it, even if they're not being risky and they're failing, it doesn't mean that, oh, well, they were good intentions, so we should bail them out. No, don't bail them out. They obviously did something wrong. They learn from it. The people that were there, they don't get a nice little corporate check. The people at the bottom don't just get to say, oh, well, we did something wrong, but I'm not actually going to think about why I did something wrong when I go to my next investment firm or go to the next bank or even start my own company. No, because the government bailed us out. The consequences weren't that bad. No, you need all 100 people that are working in that office to examine, what did I do wrong? How can I get better? And you need the executives to say, oh, wow, I really screwed up here. And they're going to restructure. They're going to take a different approach when they go somewhere else. They may not get hired somewhere else because they've ruined their career in that effect. But no, we create these little bubbles. We create these little protection rackets, essentially, for companies. And it distorts where and how our money is going, and therefore it actually makes it harder for U.S. companies to be the best and the most efficient because, and I say it's harder, they could just turn down the money, but with the money flowing in, these micro mistakes, these micro problems kind of get swept underneath the rug. Oh, we're spending an extra $10 on every single mask. I mean, that statistic doesn't seem that bad. No big deal. I mean, we're getting that federal PPE funding, which, fair enough, sure, that is the point. But maybe you could find a supplier that's making it for $5. So imagine you're using 1,000 masks. Instead of paying $100,000, now you're just paying $50,000. I mean, small scale, $10 versus $5, it is a big difference, but especially when you start looking at the larger scale, that's when you start to say, oh, maybe that is not actually something that we should be doing. Maybe we should actually be prudent about something instead of just saying, oh, well, no, we don't actually have to deal with it. And sorry, obviously, if you're paying $5 per mask and you have 1,000 masks, it's $5,000 versus $10,000. My bad. Not the large scale, but imagine you have like 10,000 masks, or you have 100,000 masks, and the large differences between the two just keep on going. Sorry that my math, though, really quick math, was off while I was giving that rant. But speaking of math and the differences between products and everything like that, that's a terrible transition. Let's just jump to our next article. It comes from Mises. The headline reads, Caitlynn Clarks bullying in the business of basketball. And I'm not going to spend the most time in the world on this one because, Caitlynn Clark, it was in the news there for a little bit. I didn't want to jump on it, mainly because I don't really have any opinions. I think if she wants to make her money, she wants to get her sponsorships, keep on going. If people are going to bully her, I don't really think it was much of bullying. I think it was trying to be intimidation. And even then, it's a sports league. People are going to be overly competitive. You've seen people bite people's ears off in soccer before. So it happens. Doesn't mean it's okay, but it happens. And also, she took it with a lot of grace. So even if I was going to think about covering it, there ain't drama there. Okay. She said, yeah, no, I understand. I got to get my bona fides. Oh, I didn't get on the U.S. team. Great. I understand there are people that have been in this game longer. They understand the system better, even if I would be a more raw talent. She didn't say that part, but my perspective would be, even if I'm a more raw talent, I mean, there are people who have been a part in training for this, who know the U.S. system, know how coach likes it, knows how we like to do our passes, knows who we're going up against because we've been doing friendlies. All those things play into it, and she was very humble about it. But the whole point that Mises is getting at here is the WNBA should be embracing Caitlynn because guess what? She's getting a $28 million sponsorship deal from Nike. Imagine people coming into the league like that, following her. Now some women say, hey, you know what? I was going to do a career in XYZ, and I'm pretty good at a sport, but I'm pretty good at basketball, but I wanted to follow my career path here because I feel like it will make more money long term. Now they see Caitlynn's making sponsorships. They can actually make some good money. They might put in those extra hours in the gym, and I know. Yeah, you're saying there like, Alex, it's not all about physical capability. There are other factors. Sure, there are other factors. Not going to disagree, but maybe it brings in one or two or three people who are able to get those sponsorships and can actually ask a higher price from some of these teams going forward. And eventually, just like the NBA, if the market permits it, more people start watching, these companies realize that there's a cultural brand behind some of these women, then we can see an uplifting of the WNBA too. And this is going to be a slow, arduous process. We can't just say, oh, no, you should be paid as much as the men. Do you bring in as much money? Not necessarily. It's ironic that the WNBA is actually owned by the NBA by, I think they have 43%. So actually, if the WNBA starts making more money, the NBA makes more money. I think they'll be totally happy with that. And I just thought that was kind of hilarious. But the point that I'm getting at is, in a free market of ideas and a free market of enterprises, if Caitlynn Clark comes in and redefines, changes the standards, and I'm not saying that she's doing that on purpose, but her coming in and being the brand she is does that, then maybe more people in the WNBA should be happy with that. And I think how they put it in here, it's a normal phrase, let the rising tide lift all boats. I think it's a little cheesy, but it can actually happen to be true, especially when you can get dragged along on the coattails of other people as they go up, and it's obviously going to affect your entire league. So, of course, you can feel the benefits of her presence. But that's enough on all that. We've gone through enough economics. Let's jump to our daily delight. This one comes from Woo Globe. Headline reads, whimsical dream adventure dog becomes a roaring superbike in his sleep. And honestly, I didn't necessarily love the editorializing when I first read this, but then I got to the end of it. I was like, oh, this author, they're trying to vividly picture what's inside the dog's mind as it kind of winds and it's kind of clawing as if it's running or having its hair blown in the wind of the bicycle. It is it's only 24 seconds, so it's a cute video. If you want to check out that, or you want to check out any of today's articles, all the links will be in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Google Podcast, which I think is still operating at this point, as well as Podvine, and the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip. So, with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.